I know most of you here, but I'll just say anyway, my name is Swami Ramananda. I'd like to offer this workshop in forgiveness because it's something that I work with, and I think most of us human beings at some time or another work with this topic of forgiveness and the challenges that it presents for us. I'll say a little bit about forgiveness in a very general way to start with, and then I want to speak about it as a part of a spiritual practice. We could say that forgiveness is not necessarily something that's only for spiritual practitioners or for someone that's on a spiritual path. It's a beautiful practice for anyone wanting to grow personally, for anyone wanting to cultivate healthier relationships and free their heart from being obstructed, to allow themselves to experience fully the potential of the heart for love and compassion and for connection. But certainly for a spiritual aspirant, it's an important part of that path of awakening, of freeing ourselves from the conditioning that obstructs our experience of our full potential, that obstructs or prevents us from fully experiencing that spiritual presence that's within us, where we know our interbeing, our interconnectedness with all of life. We could say that there are at least 3 forms of forgiveness that we can talk about. One would be forgiving ourselves, and that's probably a pretty important part of working with forgiveness, to be able to look at our own mistakes and shortcomings and forgive ourselves for them. Another aspect of forgiveness would be to ask for forgiveness from those whom we have offended in some way. Yet a third aspect is to offer forgiveness to someone who has offended us. All of these elements or aspects of forgiveness benefit from having some spiritual values as a foundation for the practice, for working with it. What do I mean by that? In the yoga tradition and in many spiritual traditions, it's important for us to recognize that the way we see things is not necessarily the truth. We see things filtered through our own lens of perception. Like sunglasses, our vision is shaded by our past experiences, by our desires, our hopes, our expectations, by the things that we think of as important elements of our own ability to be happy. You could call it the conditioning. It's made up of our past experiences. It's made up of our understanding of the way things work in the world, our understanding of what makes us happy. In the yoga tradition, we understand that each of us forms a kind of identity or ego, a way of understanding ourselves that allows us to function in the world. We have to have some sense of ourselves as an individual that can function. But in the yoga tradition, we understand that that sense of individuality should be complemented with the understanding that we are interconnected as well. We're not only separate beings. We function separately, but we're very much interconnected with each other. But we understand that the messages of our culture have ingrained in us, for most of us, they've ingrained in us this idea that if we can acquire or achieve certain things, that those things will be the source of our happiness. And I'll just give an example so it's not so conceptual. That even if it's unconscious, if I think of appreciation, admiration as the things that are good for me, that make me feel good, that make me happy. Of course, there's nothing wrong with those things, but it's a mistake to think of, I have to have those things in order to be at peace with myself. They're nice to have, but if I'm depending on other people to approve of me, to admire me, appreciate me, if I want to always impress other people, then I'm setting myself up for a lot of disappointment because it will never always be the way I'd like it to be. And then when someone attempts to give me constructive criticism, I'm going to see that as a threat because they're not complimenting me, they're not appreciating me, they're giving me feedback, right? They're criticizing me. Even if it's meant to be constructive, I can interpret that. This is what I mean by my perception is filtered through the lens of my conditioning. I can interpret their behavior as threatening, as offensive, even if it's intended to help me grow as a person, to help me function, to help me understand what I'm doing that's incorrect. Is that clear to you all? How we can, misunderstand misperceive what's being offered to us. Just like two people can see the same thing and report it vastly differently because they're both seeing it through their own lens, conditioned by their past experience. So that's one thing that spiritual understanding can help us with. So we're not so fixated on the way that we see things, and we have some openness towards understanding that other people may see things differently. That will help us a lot. A second element of spiritual understanding that can be really helpful is the ability to discriminate between the behavior of another person and the spiritual presence within them, not to equate the two things. When someone makes a mistake, that doesn't make that person a bad person. That makes them human. That's what we call being human. And this will help us forgive ourselves. If we can understand that, yes, this is part of the human experience. It's by our mistakes that we grow and learn. How many times does a baby stand up, fall down when it's learning to walk? And we know that's a natural part of the human growth process. And it's the same on the emotional level. How many times do we get angry and speak in a way that's hurtful to other people and then realize later, I shouldn't have said that? So this is part of our growth as a human being. And if we can accept that our mistakes are opportunities to grow, then we can more easily forgive ourselves. And we can remember that when other people make a mistake, when other people say something offensive, that also is an opportunity for them to grow. And we don't need to develop a hatred or dislike for that person just because they made a mistake, because they spoke incorrectly or they were hurtful in some moment. We can know that that person, just like we are, is still worthy of our respect, our compassion. Those principles can go a long way to helping us. One other principle from spiritual life that I think is helpful is humility. It's a willingness to recognize the limitations of the way that we understand life, that we understand ourselves, and a willingness to open ourselves to other perspectives, other points of view, and to learn and grow. So we could say that humility means that we're open to other perspectives than our own, and we're not fixated on what we know, and we're ready to listen to other perspectives. We're really ready to admit our own limitations and mistakes. And that also can help a lot with forgiveness. So those are a few spiritual principles that I thought were important to bring into this picture as we approach the practice of forgiveness. But let me pause here and see if there are any comments or questions so far. Maybe I'll say a few things about forgiving other people in a general way. And then I actually want to go through step by step some steps towards working with forgiveness. I want to clarify that when we talk about forgiving another person, we're not talking about condoning their behavior or accepting hurtful behavior, inappropriate behavior. We're not talking about letting other people hurt us. We don't mean that we make friends with them necessarily. We don't even have to interact with that person that we're forgiving. Because sometimes forgiveness is a practice that we can apply towards someone who's not even available to us to speak to them. They may have left the body or not even be somewhere where we know them, where we can reach them. It doesn't mean being nice to them. It doesn't mean allowing injustice to go on. It doesn't mean that we refrain from speaking up against injustice or that we patch things up with that person and pretend that everything's okay. Forgiveness, in the sense that I want to talk about, is primarily a movement of the heart to release anger or ill will towards another person, or to release shame towards ourselves, and to approach another person in humility and ask for forgiveness from them. I think a good place to start with the practice of forgiveness is not to interact with the other person at all, but actually to practice within one's own heart. And that's primarily the place. And if one sincerely feels like there can be a connection made with the other person, or if that other person has asked for forgiveness, then perhaps interacting with them can be useful. And not to approach another person if you've still got some anger in your heart towards them. You really have to get past that obstacle. And that's one of the things I want to talk about, is the obstacles. And that is the reasons to practice forgiveness, right? I talked about what forgiveness is not, but there are very good reasons to practice it. One teacher said recently that to hold anger or ill will towards another person is like drinking poison, hoping it will hurt that other person. Another teacher said it's like picking up a hot coal with the intention to throw it at another person. It burns you first. There are even medical studies show a strong correlation between those who exhibit a lot of anger and hostility in an outward way, and the correlation between the way of being and heart disease, and a correlation with other chronic disease for those who have those kind of feelings but repress them and don't express them. And then there's Thich Nhat Hanh beautifully in his book Pieces Every Step talks about how suffering is often passed down from one generation to another. The parents, unintentionally even, wounding their children in certain ways, causing their children to suffer, and then the children taking it out on their friends or their own children. And that can be passed down generation to generation. And when one really is willing to look deeply and work with these principles, with this kind of practice, they can interrupt and stop that transmission. They can have a real impact on their own generation and the generations to come by their willingness to be humble, to look more deeply, really contribute to the collective consciousness. But probably a good primary motivation, immediate motivation, is to relieve the pain of holding that bitterness in your heart. Bitterness is a good word, because what are you doing to your own heart when you hold those kind of feelings? It may feel like you're keeping another person responsible because you're holding on to your anger at them. It may feel like you're protecting yourself from them. It may feel like you're keeping them at a distance by holding those feelings. But that kind of boundary can be established without holding anger in our hearts. It's possible to protect yourself and to set boundaries with someone who's hurt you, but without holding on to those feelings that are ultimately hurting you. And it's helpful, as I've kind of said before, to recognize that in our relationships with each other, we are often unconsciously attempting to sustain and protect an identity that we feel comfortable with. And it's easy to hurt each other when our identity is threatened, or our sense of who we are is threatened by someone else's point of view, and vice versa. A little story that relates to this that I think can be helpful. And this is a story that I read in this book, Forgiveness, A Bold Choice for a Peaceful Heart. It's a pretty good book on forgiveness if you're looking for a book. I can send it to you in an email if you like. Robin Kassarjian. She tells this story of a woman, we'll call the woman Megan, that has a job that she really likes, but the boss in her job is really domineering and really difficult. The boss is constantly micromanaging her, criticizing her, finding fault with everything she does, pushing her to do more, to do better. So this person, Megan, really likes the job, but boy, she can't stand working with this boss. And so she bristles and kind of fights back, and they have this difficult relationship that makes her uncomfortable, that makes her question whether she wants to keep that job even though she likes it. And she thinks in her mind, the boss is really a bad person, a difficult person. She kind of labels her. This is somebody that I don't like and I don't want to be around, and I want to interact with her as little as possible. In this story that I heard, Megan accompanies a friend of hers to a workshop that involves understanding the underlying motives behind a person's behavior. It's some kind of a workshop about personal growth and psychology. And one of the things that comes up in this workshop is that it can sometimes see beneath someone's behavior to the underlying need that's there. And she gets curious about her boss, and she begins thinking about what is it within this boss that makes her so difficult, that makes her like that, so obnoxious and questioning. And so this person, Megan, begins to soften a little bit in her relationship to her boss as she kind of watches and thinks about what may be going on underneath the boss's behavior. And as Megan softens and tries to be more compassionate and more kind of interested in the well-being of the boss also begins to soften. Things begin to shift a little bit at a time. And finally, at some point, Megan even asks the boss something about how she's doing personally, a personal question. And the boss responds to that. And eventually, the boss is able to just acknowledge what's going on in her life, that she just went through a divorce and that her son has recently been diagnosed with a terminal illness. Megan begins to understand that the boss is really struggling in her personal life and that her work life is the one place where she's trying to keep some control. To shorten the story, they eventually become friends. Megan really comes to appreciate what a beautiful person this boss is. Someone that she had initially labeled as really a bad person that I could never respect and appreciate and that I want to interact with as little as possible. They eventually become friends. I thought that was such an interesting example of how just a little bit of effort on the part of Megan to try to have some understanding of this person began to shift their relationship. And of course, don't try this at home. It doesn't mean that every time it's going to work this way. But the point is, once we can understand someone a little more, the compassion comes so much more easily. That natural sense of compassion that we can have for each other, knowing that ultimately we all are doing the best that we can. It's something that Thich Nhat Hanh in his book beautifully talks about. I'm referring to this book, Peace is Every Step, from Thich Nhat Hanh, one of my favorite books of all time. And he beautifully talks about that compassion is a natural outcome of really attempting to understand someone, to look beneath their behavior and to know that there's something going on within them ends up impacting the way that they behave. Pema Chodron also talks about the same principle that if we're willing to look at our own mistakes, to be humble enough to acknowledge where we went wrong and understand what was underneath that mistake, what triggered my reaction, what triggered my lashing out at someone. If we're willing to look at that and understand it, then it becomes much easier to believe, even if you don't understand, to know that in another person as well, there is that same kind of triggering that can happen from maybe some wound that someone experienced from the past. Who knows what trauma someone went through that has shaped their behavior in some way, that has conditioned them to respond or react in certain ways. An analogy that around this idea of distinction between the behavior of a person and the spiritual presence within them, that is the same. That is the ground of being that we share. An analogy I once heard that I really like for this: when you look at a lamp, you see the shade. And if you bring two lamps together, it's the shades that touch. It's like the ego, the personality. But within both lamps is the light. And the light is the same. But when we clash with each other, it's the shades. I want to focus more now for a little while on forgiveness towards other people. I'll walk through some steps that I think are useful in that process. Because it's not, I don't call it a practice or a process. Because to me, forgiveness is not just like a one-time thing that you do it and it's done. It's often something, especially if you've really been hurt by someone, been hurt deeply, it may not come easily. And it may be something that has to be practiced over time. So often we form a judgment about someone and then we see little things that we add into, reinforce that. And then with people that we like, we think good about, we excuse those things, those same things. Like, oh, that probably didn't mean it. First principle that I want to suggest, or step I want to suggest in working with forgiveness, is a general principle, just observing the way that we judge people. How easy it is to do by seeing some little behavior. You might see someone in a bad moment and form a judgment based on that. And that person could be wonderful in many ways. An example of that to me is, it's interesting how easily people get triggered in traffic. How easy it is to get angry at another driver. You've never met them. You'll never speak to them. But in that moment, you see them as a bad driver or someone that, you want to show your fingers at. It's so easy to, you often experience this kind of anger that drivers have towards one another. A snap judgment. And a practice that I think can contradict that or counteract that tendency is to practice looking at everyone that you see on the street or the other drivers with this intention of having compassion for them and assuming the best about them. Assuming that they're in a hurry because their partner is in the hospital, or they're desperate to get to the courtroom on time, or some urgent matter, to make an excuse for them, to assume the best for them. Many years ago, I studied something called reevaluation counseling. And one of the principles in this was the idea that everyone's doing the best they can all the time. It's a pretty broad statement, but it means that even when someone behaves poorly, that's the best they can do in that moment, given their circumstances, given their past, given their own traumas and triggers. And that's a pretty big generalization. It may may not be easy to embrace that way of thinking for everyone, but it's a great practice just to think that way towards the people that we run into in the street, the clerks that we run into. I can share another quick anecdote from a friend who was working as a clerk in a store, and a customer came in, and it was a small store. The customer was asking questions of the clerk, my friend, and being obnoxious in general, dissatisfied with this and wondering about that, and really being kind of, and my friend found herself taken aback and beginning to form these kind of judgments about this customer. But then when the customer finally came to check out, my friend just took a chance and said something like, "How are you doing today? Are you okay?" And right then and there, the customer paused and said, "Yeah, I'm really having a tough time." And she went on to describe what was going on in her life. And it totally changed the situation. Just like that, they had a friendly exchange. And it simply took a little bit of willingness to look beyond the surface of that person's behavior. So the idea is, the person who wrote that book, Robin Kassarjian, she calls it a forgiveness walk or a compassion walk, where you just assume that everyone is doing the best they can. And you practice just having compassion for people in a very general way. This also comes easier when we're actively looking at our own mistakes, forgiving ourselves, seeing that the way that we make mistakes, knowing that's a part of the human experience, knowing that's how we grow in the spiritual path, then it becomes easier to think that way towards other people. Another step in this process of forgiveness is asking ourselves, especially if it feels difficult to think about forgiving someone that's really hurt us, then asking ourselves, what is the obstacle? Why is it difficult? What am I gaining? Maybe this is the question. What does it feel like my anger does for me to hold it? What is it doing for me? Is it helping me feel right and proving to myself that I'm right and they're wrong? Is it helping keep them away from me? Does it feel like forgiving them would somehow let them get off the hook, like they get away with it if I forgive them? So what is it that feels like my ill will, my bitterness, my anger? What does it do for me? What does it feel like? How is it helping me in some way? It's an interesting question. And if we're really willing to look at these things, and that's part of this process, then we may discover something that feels like a benefit that our anger has given us, but ultimately isn't, because it's ultimately hurting us. What feels better, right? To be in the heart, to be soft, and to have your heart open and capable of love, or to be right. One person said, I want justice. I want justice done. And if I let go of my ill will, it feels like they're getting away with it. There is no justice. And you can see how they would feel that way. But if we really think about the benefits that we can receive from letting go of the anger within our hearts, it doesn't preclude the idea of justice being done if that's possible. It's possible to forgive someone in your heart and still press charges, if I can say it that way. It's possible to hold someone responsible, and if it's possible, to correct them, but to have forgiveness in our hearts towards that person. I can share a little anecdote that relates to that. It's a very small situation, so it was an easy practice for me. And some of you may have heard me, and Snehan, you probably heard me tell this story before. This many years ago when I lived in New York, there was another person living in the Institute there that I was just getting to know, and we were somewhat friendly with each other. But one day she came to me and said, I can see that you're lying to me about something. I wasn't lying to her at all. I was being completely honest with her about something. But she was convinced I was lying. And I tried to explain myself. And she said, no, now you're just making up more lies. Defend your initial lie. I thought, wow, I can't believe it. This person won't even give me a chance to explain myself. What can I do? And I felt righteously sort of angry at her. I didn't do anything terrible, but I kind of was miffed, and I walked away in a huff, and I sat at my desk. What was the use of talking to her if she won't even listen to me? And I sat at my desk feeling righteously kind of irritated with her. How dare she think that way? Who does she think she is? Etc. You can imagine the thoughts that were in my mind. Then later, because it wasn't that big of a situation, this wasn't someone I was really close to. She didn't do anything terrible. She just thought I was lying. So it wasn't that difficult for me to kind of stop and really begin to just look in my own heart and think about what was going on within me. Why was I angry? This is an important step in the process of opening our hearts to someone, is to see what's going on in my heart. Why am I angry at this person? There wasn't a deep anger in this situation. And I saw that. really the reason I'm unhappy with this person or angry at the person is because I was expecting her to trust me. I had the expectation, I had the desire that she would think of me as a fair person who wouldn't lie. And so she would trust me. And she didn't trust me. So I feel justified in being angry at her because she should trust me. That's my perception. That's my point of view. She should trust me. And I saw that even underneath my anger, I was hurt. I was offended that she wouldn't trust me, even when I tried to explain myself. So when I saw what was going on in my heart, I recognized I don't need to be angry at her. That's the best she can do. For some reason, she thinks I'm lying. I don't know why, but I don't need to be angry with her. I even went back and apologized to her and said, I'm sorry you feel that way. I'll just make an extra effort to really be honest with you so that you can develop some trust for me over time. And only years later did I understand, or sometime later did I find out from her that her father was someone that deceived her. Her father was a person who was very deceptive and constantly deceived her. And it occurred to me later that she probably saw me in some ways much like her father. The point being that an obstacle towards forgiveness can be the anger that one still is harboring in their hearts. And if you can't let it go of that anger, then it's a big leap to think of forgiving that person. So one of those obstacles is perhaps the feeling of anger that's still residing in our hearts. And for that, we probably have to work with that anger before we're ready to really work with forgiveness. And working with anger requires that we have a willingness to stop thinking about the other person and to really reflect on what's going on within us, to really look at what's behind that feeling that we have, how we feel offended or harmed by that other person, and even to work with it on a physical level. Many years ago, I remember a teacher named Patricia Walden, an Iyengar teacher, saying that our issues are in our tissues. Clever saying. And the way that a strong emotion, we even hold it in our bodies. So even working with Hatha Yoga practice, restorative poses that help us release tension, can be a part of this effort to work with ourselves in an emotional way, as well as a willingness to allow ourselves to feel our feelings. So often our feelings are uncomfortable, they're painful, they're not that acceptable in our culture to show that or to talk about having angry feelings or depressed feelings or sadness. They may feel to be socially unacceptable or a sign of spiritual defect, spiritual weakness, or they just may be plain uncomfortable for us to feel. It may be much easier to block our feelings out or repress them rather than allow ourselves to really feel them. I remember in a depression workshop once, someone saying, my depression, what does it feel like? It feels like there's an iron door covering that feeling. I can't even go there. I have to protect myself for it. It's locked away in a safe behind an iron door. To really work with our feeling of being hurt or our feeling of anger, we have to allow ourselves to release that feeling, allow that energy to move, allow it to release physically from our tissues, but also from our hearts. And that means being safe enough, having the support that we need in order to be safe enough to feel that feeling and let it out. I don't mean explode with it. I don't mean beat a pillow or chop wood necessarily. I mean, just allowing ourselves to feel the energy of that feeling. And for that, what's required is safety. A child will cry more easily in the arms of its mother. We all have that need to feel safe when we're encountering something within us that's really dark and painful. So the presence of a therapist or a really good friend that won't judge us, a journal can be a great way to get something out in a very safe way that doesn't feel like it will incur the judgment of anyone else. Anger can be expressed in writing a letter to a person that will never be sent, just as a way of getting in touch with that feeling and allow that energy of the feeling to release. Our expectations might be very reasonable, but if someone's unable to meet our expectation, then holding on to the expectation is only hurting us. Our expectations, our attachments, our desires are all about us, something that we have to work with within our own hearts. And the beauty of working with them, when we are able to let go of those expectations, then we soften towards another person, and it has the potential to change the dynamic between us. Just like it did in that little example that I gave, the other resident of the New York Institute. I was able to soften towards her and I felt sorry that she didn't trust me. And And I double down my effort to really be clear and honest with her. But it's not always that easy. Sometimes these things are very long-standing, problematic, and we may never see any change in the attitude of another person. And all we can do is let go of our own expectation and wish them well. Another step. All right, so I've talked about watching the tendency towards to judge others as one step, and practice forgiving everyone or having compassion for everyone, not being swept away by the surface behavior that we see informing and categorizing people. And then looking at our own, the ways that we tend to hurt other people, and learning not to judge ourselves harshly, to have compassion for ourselves. And then looking at the obstacles towards forgiveness and asking ourselves, what is this anger or ill will that I'm holding on to? What is it doing for me? Then one of those obstacles could be the anger that we're really holding makes it difficult for us to think of forgiving and working with that anger itself. Yet another step is a willingness to look beneath the surface of that person's behavior and look at them through the eyes of compassion. Look at them with the understanding that beneath that behavior, there is a person worthy of our respect and our compassion, just as that person Megan was able to do for her boss. Then one thing I could do, if you all are willing to experiment with this, is a guide, a forgiveness exercise. We've been sitting for a while. If you need to stretch, feel free to stand up and stretch, because what I'm going to do is have us all sit with our eyes closed and do a visualization, a kind of guided reflection. So make yourself comfortable. This guided reflection is something you can do with your eyes closed or your eyes downcast. And I'll just reiterate to begin it that forgiveness is a conscious choice that we make within ourselves to release anger or ill will from our own hearts. And it does not imply that we're condoning someone else's behavior. I also want to restate that it may be a process, not a one-time thing. Right? So we don't expect when we practice an exercise like this that the issue will be completely resolved. It's simply a way of opening the door towards that possibility. And each person can work with it at your own speed. There may be some step that I suggest that you're not ready to take, and that's fine. But let's start by having everyone visualize themselves in a place where they feel really safe and uplifted. It might be at your altar, in your bed, somewhere in nature. You may want to visualize someone with you, like a teacher, a friend, a support person. Visualize yourself in a situation where you feel at peace, safe, unafraid, in control of your surroundings. And then, along with working with some difficulty, start by just acknowledging the innate goodness, that spiritual presence that's within each of us, the ground of being that we all share, that naturally expresses itself as love and compassion for each other, that naturally finds joy in serving each other and longing for others to suffer less. Just acknowledge that same spiritual essence is in everyone. Then also, let's remind ourselves that often the way that we grow is through painful experiences, right? And that our painful experiences can present an opportunity. They can be strong teachers for us. They can be an important way of learning something about ourselves. And that we benefit from being humble and are willing to acknowledge what we need to learn. Then if you're ready to do so, call to mind someone you'd like to practice forgiveness with. If a few people come to mind, just pick one person. It doesn't have to be the most difficult situation. So call that person to mind. If you have some very strong feelings towards that person, if it immediately gives rise to anger in your heart, you could even envision that person as a child with the same hopes and dreams that you had as a child. See if you can somehow, along with that hurtful behavior that you've witnessed or experienced from that person, can you also confirm or reaffirm to yourself that there is this essentially good spiritual presence within them? And in whatever way you feel comfortable, envision that person there with you in your safe space. Envision them open and willing to listen. And just share with them the truth of your own experience. Not in a way that's judgmental, not in a way that's blaming them completely for what happened, but share with them how your experience with them has hurt you, how you suffered from it. If this brings up a lot of feelings, then take a few deep breaths. Allow those feelings to come up. Know that that's part of this process, is allowing the feelings to be there. The feelings themselves are not a bad thing. They're simply an energy that needs to be released. And to acknowledge the truth of those feelings. There's a relief in letting them be there, letting them come and go. But envision this other person is listening to you. Let them be there. Let them be quiet. You have the opportunity to share what your experience was with them without any resistance on their part. Then see if you can see underneath the surface of their behavior some way that they themselves are hurting, are suffering, struggling. And ask yourself this question. Am I expecting something from them that they're just not able to give? If I'm hoping, am I hoping or holding them responsible in a way that they can't fulfill? Can I release them from my judgment? And it doesn't mean that you accept their behavior. You may even want to commit yourself to correcting their behavior if it's appropriate, if that's part of this picture, or to fighting similar injustice. But can you release them? Can you release your own heart from the feelings that you've been holding towards them? If you're ready to, make a conscious choice to release resentment, bitterness, knowing that these feelings only hurt you and prevent you from growing. Right? Breathe into your heart. See if it feels possible to let go a little bit more. Knowing that you can still protect yourself, you can still have a healthy boundary with this person, but you need not hold these feelings in your heart. in whatever way feels appropriate. You could speak some words to them or simply release the feeling. Simply see it draining out of your heart, even as you might still protect yourself from that person. If you're not ready to practice forgiveness, then respect that resistance and maybe see what the obstacle is. What benefit does it feel like to hold on to it? Take a few more deep breaths. Envision that a real healing can come to your heart by letting go of resentment towards another person, even if you have no contact with them. This is something that you might repeat a few times. Examining this situation that you've been in, the relationship, the feelings, and seeing how it can feel to let go more and more by having compassion for yourself, by taking care of your own heart. We can end this reflection simply by accepting whatever you were able to do or not do, knowing that, again, this is a process that takes time. And as you're ready to, you can open your eyes. If it's useful for you, you might jot down a few notes. If you feel like you learned something or there's something you want to remember about that exercise. Yeah, I think I'll just read a few sentences from Thich Nhat Hanh. He writes, "When you understand, you cannot help but love. You cannot get angry. To develop understanding, you have to practice looking at all living beings with the eyes of compassion. When you understand, you cannot help but love." Of course, to understand means to stand under, right? To have the willingness to put yourself in the shoes of another person. And to assume, even if you can't put yourself in the shoes of another person, to assume that the circumstances from the past have shaped them into the person that they are now. There was a book and a movie made about the book many years ago called The Joy Luck Club. Any of you remember that book or the movie, Joy Luck Club? It depicted these Asian women. I forget if they were Chinese or Japanese. I don't remember. Anyway, in the beginning of the movie or in the book, you get to know these women as older women with adult children. Sometimes their behavior seems so domineering. They're so oppressive. They're so controlling of their adult children. And you can't understand why. Why are they like that? And I remember finding myself thinking, geez, ease up. Why is she being so difficult and so hard on her daughter? And then at some point, and I'm remembering the movie better than the book, it flashes back to their own childhood, their own young adulthood. And you see what terrible trauma they went through. And you can't believe that they even developed into such a basically good person now. You can't believe that they made it through those terrible moments in their own past. And you see what shaped them. And then you think, wow, it's a wonder that they're doing as well as they are. And that to me was a beautiful lesson. And I think that's an example of what Thich Nhat Hanh's talking about. If ever we have the chance to really see what's beneath someone's behavior, then we would understand. And as soon as we understand, we have compassion for them and we long for them to suffer less. And this is equally true for ourselves. Anytime that we judge ourselves harshly, can we acknowledge that, yes, we also have been harmed, wounded from our past. And many times our unhealthy behaviors, our addictions are triggered by some unconscious trauma that we've experienced or challenging experiences that we've had that have never been fully resolved. So we also can practice forgiveness towards ourselves, right? Towards the young person that we were then that made those mistakes that we made. So that's basically what I wanted to share with you all. We have just a couple minutes left, and maybe we can spend a couple of minutes just sending peaceful healing energies out to all those who are suffering, to all those who are struggling with holding on to anger and forgiveness in their hearts, and to those who've hurt others out of their own suffering. I think that would be a beautiful practice. We can chant the mantra Loka Samasta Sukhino Bhavantu 3 times together. And that the meaning of that chant, most of you know, it's a way of wishing for all beings to be filled with peace and joy, love and light, right? For all beings to be free of suffering. It's like a loving kindness or Maitreyi practice. So we can chant it 3 times. And feel that we send healing energy outward, and then have a moment of silence. If you like, as we chant that mantra, you can hold your hands together at the heart and feel the heart actively sending that energy outward. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. As we say the translation in English, if it's helpful, offer that to yourself as well. May the entire universe be filled with peace and joy, love and light. In a moment of silence, we let that energy continue to reverberate in our hearts and be sent outward. We can end by bowing to that spiritual presence in ourselves and each other with the following lines. May the light of truth overcome all darkness. Victory to that light. Jai Sri Satguru Maharaj Ki. Jai. Thank you all for coming. Thanks for your contributions.